Good morning, Joe. How are you?
Doing great, Mark. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. I'm excited about who you talked to today. It's a mutual friend of ours, somebody that is in the industry. And if anyone is in the industry of buying and selling websites, if you're interested in this industry, you definitely have heard of Chris Yates before.
Well, hopefully they've heard of him and used him for due diligence. I first learned about Chris and Centurica when I was selling a content-based website, and it was a New York-based seller and a buyer that had quite a bit of experience, and he was from the UK. And even though he had a ton of experience, he hired Chris to do the SEO due diligence on the site. And I tell you what, the report came back, and it was a scathing report. It was listing all of the awful things that were wrong with this particular website. And I thought, oh my God, this is awful. And then I reread it, and I had the seller read it and reread it. And really what it did was create a list of all of the real gaps and opportunities that were available for this particular business. And I talked to the buyer about it, and he said, that's what I look for. That's what I'm always looking for. And the purchase went through, and it worked out very well. It was fascinating. It just created paths to growth beyond what the seller had already listed in the client interview that we do so thoroughly with.
Yeah, so Chris is the owner of Centurica, and oddly enough, he's actually not the original founder of Centurica. That was founded by a guy named Justin Gilchrist and Brian O'Neill, who also works with Quiet Light Brokerage right now. So we kind of come full circle on this. I remember when Centurica started up, and I was at Affiliate Summit West with Jason, and one of our the guys that we know, Chris Kite, came up to me and said, "Hey, have you heard of the Centurica service? They're going to do buy-side due diligence." And I remember I said, they're absolutely insane for trying to do something like that because of all the liability issues. But they've really come around and done a good job. And I've been impressed with what Chris has done to try and make the process not just about poking holes, but really helping buyers discover what they need to know about a business before they actually go through with the acquisition. And that's a really useful service to have. Both for buyers and also for brokers and for sellers as well, as long as there's that nice communication, which he's been really working on making sure that there's that back and forth and kind of collaborative discussion over the business itself.
Well, it's interesting. He talks about certain things that they look for in terms of financial due diligence and SEO and link building, Amazon businesses, and points out a few things that are egregious errors that sellers will put forth, and really common, easy to spot things that buyers can look for so they don't waste their time and energy before they make an offer on the business.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, outside of Centurica, Chris is also known for putting together a really good group of people called Rhodium. It's a mastermind group. And then every year they host a conference out in Las Vegas called the Rhodium Conference. It's a small conference. So I think he limits it to around 100, 120 people. It's specifically for buying and selling websites. We've been sponsors of the conference now. This will be our third year running. It's coming up in just a few weeks. At the end of October or beginning of November, isn't it?
It's at the end of October this year, 26th through 28th, I think.
That's right. Okay, so it's coming up in just a few weeks, and hopefully this episode gets out before the conference. And I think they might have a couple of spots that just opened up. I know I just had something come up where I can no longer go, so it might be worthwhile checking to see if you can actually go if you're listening to this. But it's a good event. I mean, he brings in some really high quality people, people who really know the industry of buying and selling websites really well, and bring a pretty diverse set of skills to the group as well.
Yeah, the first time I attended, I think I either said it to you or Jason that I heard more intelligent conversations in the first 24 hours than I'd heard in the previous 2 years when it came to buying and selling websites. So it's a great group that Chris has put together. He's a really bright guy, and he's honest. He's got integrity. He works hard, and he's looking to really help people through Centurica make sure they make good investments. So I love this episode. I love what he's doing for buyers in terms of helping them make good investments. And I think it's going to be a real help to people that listen to the podcast.
Well, I'm excited that you got a chance to talk to him. I'm a little jealous that you were the one that got to talk to him. But I'm excited to hear what he had to say. Do we want to go to the interview now?
Yeah, let's just jump right into it. Hey, Chris, welcome to the Quiet Light Podcast.
Hey, Joe. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Now, Chris, you are a partner in Centurica. You founded Rhodium Weekend. There's a lot of things about you that I know and that I don't know. So I think it'd be better if you just gave us a little bit of background on yourself.
Sure. Yeah, I'll tell the story as quickly as possible and feel free to dig in more. But basically in 2009, I was operating a digital marketing agency, providing services to small companies, design, development, marketing, etc. And it was one of those things where I always felt like client work was not the most scalable approach to business. And so I was okay with where I was at, but I always had this urge to not just build everybody else's businesses through my marketing services, but to start building my own assets. And somewhat fortuitously around then, I had a former business partner, mentor, called me up and said, "Hey, Chris, I just sold my company to a large acquirer, and I am looking for the next thing to do once my earnout ends. Why don't we put our heads together and come up with something to do?" So we started looking around, and basically at some point we came up with the idea to go out and start buying some businesses, and looked at online businesses as an opportunity for us. And so in that first year, starting I think in 2010, we bought I think like 10 or 12 different websites of varying ranges from the $1,000 website up to like a six-figure sort of website. Went a little bit crazy with it, had no real strategy, made a bunch of mistakes, but the returns were quite phenomenal for us. And it was a lot more fun for me to do that than to deal with kind of the clients and employee headaches that I had been dealing with over the last several years. So I ended up selling my marketing agency and went full-time into basically acquiring and building up a portfolio of online businesses. So one of the things I have a couple books that have influenced me, and one of those books was The 4-Hour Workweek. And so I had this idea that I'd build these things up and make them somewhat passive, and kind of get to the point where I had the time and location freedom that everybody wants. And I was able to kind of accomplish that around 2012. But what I didn't realize was actually how isolating it is to be on your computer all day, not have employees, not be on the phone with clients and things like that. And so I was really craving that connection that comes from, being around like-minded people. So I looked around and like, where can I go to meet other people who do what I do? And there was no real one place to do that. And so my business partner and I decided to start an event. And that's, as you mentioned, Rhodium Weekend, that's what that became. And over the years, I've found that to be really a passion for me of getting smart people in a room and getting them to connect with each other and share experiences and do deals together. So that's really become my passion. And then a couple of years ago, one of the people who had been involved in my event for several years is named Justin Gilchrist, founded a company called Centurica. And he approached me and said, "Chris, I'm looking to create $1 billion company. I don't think Centurica is going to be it. And there's only like one or two people that I would even consider selling this company to you, and you are one of them." And so we did a deal. I took over operations and have really been building out the company, completely replace the team, adjust our packages and things like that. And it's been a really fun process of helping people who are looking to buy businesses to make sure that they don't get in the wrong business for them.
That's an incredible story. There are so many questions I could ask because I want to delve into, all of the small companies that you bought up to the $100,000 company or six-figure company, and wins and losses and Google algorithm updates and how they impacted you. I think, I don't know if you know my story. One of the benefits of being an entrepreneur and now being in the position of this advisor like you is that we have big successes, and along with those big successes is the inevitable failure. I bought a site when I sold my business through Quiet Light in 2010. I bought one in early 2012. It was actually March 30th, 2012. Oh, no. Yeah, I had 42 amazing days, and then something happened. And most people don't know what happened when I say it like that. Do you know what happened?
Yeah, April 24th was a day I will never forget. And I'd be happy to share my story with that. But yeah, go ahead.
It's the Penguin update, right?
Yes.
Exactly. I had a number of keywords on page one, and shortly thereafter, half were on page two, and then all were on page 2, 3, 4, 5. Eventually, it wouldn't even buy me a cup of coffee. It took about 2 years, and I was no expert in in SEO. All I did was develop good quality content over a period of 5 years, along with spending a lot of PPC money, and then sold my business. I
Right.
really didn't have an expertise other than do the right thing and put out good stuff for good people to find, and it worked. But let's hear your story about April. Was it April 24th or April 12th?
For me, I think it was April 24th. I could be wrong about that, but
A painful month, no matter what.
yeah. No, like this, to put it in the simplest terms, is when we started out, we loved the idea of buying stuff that was driven by Google Organic, because in theory, it's all free traffic and that kind of thing. But what we didn't realize is that when you buy a business, you're buying all the things that that person did previously to that business. And I talk about businesses in terms of like, there's money-making hacks. To me, those are not businesses. And then there's actual businesses. And what we were buying, not realizing it at the time, were a bunch of money-making hacks. In other words, people did things that were not sustainable in order to get rankings. And then Google decided to change the rules. And those things that they did became our problem, essentially. And so overnight, I think we lost about half of our traffic across probably about 60, 70% of our portfolio. And revenue followed as well. So one site in particular, we'd bet big on, and it was ranking for a very high traffic, high valuable term, and it lost that ranking. And one of the cool things I was able to do, and I look at this as number one, a mistake, but more a learning lesson and an area of confidence that I now have. I was able to take that site that was completely driven by Google organic traffic and completely change the model on that site and turn it into one that was completely driven by paid search. So no longer had to rely just on Google organic traffic. In reality, I pretty much started from scratch on that business because I would have been, but once you have $100,000 or whatever into a site, it's that sunk cost fallacy that I got to try to get that back the same way that I lost it, right? So, but anyway, I was able to recover from that by completely changing the model of the business and actually turning it into a business instead of a money-making hack.
Well, I wish I knew you then, because I didn't fix mine. I eventually lost it. It cost me about $250,000 and
Ouch.
Was one hell of a lesson. You talked about Google changing the rules. I think what they really did, looking back, Chris, is improve the rules. Because as you said, they're not money-making hacks that we deal with as much anymore. They're real, legitimate, sustainable, profitable businesses that buyers are investing their life savings into, and we want to make sure that they're making a good investment. You and I first came across each other when a client of mine through Quiet Light Brokerage hired this company, Centurica, and this guy, Chris Yates, to do a SEO report. And it came back, and what it did was tell that buyer everything that was wrong with SEO with this particular business, with the links, with the keyword density, with all sorts of different things. And when I first read it, I was deeply alarmed. But when I talked to the buyer and she read deeper and deeper into it, and I read deeper and deeper into it, really what you did was show her all the things that are wrong with this wonderful business that she was buying that was sustainable and was growing consistently, but you showed her a roadmap to how to fix these things. Maybe it wasn't your intention, but it's what happened. Is that part of the intention, or you just focusing on things that are wrong, or are you also showing this is what's wrong, this is what they did, and this is how to fix it? How do you guys approach it when somebody comes to you for SEO analysis and website review?
Yeah. There's a couple of pieces to the puzzle here. So one is, it depends on where people are in the process. So if they have not, signed a letter of intent and agreed upon a price and those kinds of things, and there's not a deal kind of on the table, what we're primarily hired to do is risk analysis for that business. And I always tell people that in every risk, there's also an opportunity if you flip it around. In some cases, opportunities can also be flipped around to risks, but that's a different story. But so, if we identify a potential risk in a business, really it's just looking at it and saying, let's say that one of the things we talk about is that it's heavily reliant upon Google organic traffic, maybe 80% of the traffic is coming from 2 or 3 keywords, right? That to us is, and I think to pretty much any objective person would be considered a potential risk. It doesn't mean it's a major risk. It doesn't mean it's a minor risk. It's up to the buyer to decide, is this an issue for them or not? But essentially what we do is we try to be an objective third party to identify potential issues for a business so that a buyer can go in with their eyes open instead of stepping into a business where they didn't know what they were buying, right? That these possible risks could be there.
I wish that I had hired you in early 2012, because I sold a business that had thousands of keywords that ranked well, hundreds on the first and second page of Google. And then a year and a half later, I bought one that had 6 keywords that ranked on page 1. I just didn't know what I was doing, even though I was a successful online entrepreneur. So I'm glad that you're around. I wish that you were around in 2012. But then again, Chris, I love what I do at Quiet Light. Like you, I was isolated running my business 20 hours a week, making a wonderful living from my home office and not talking to anyone except my developer. And all we did was yell at each other. Because it was Dreamweaver, and it was really, really hard. But now I get to help people, and I really enjoy it. I refer people to you sometimes before they're under LOI, before they come to me and list their business for sale. And buyers, when they talk about due diligence and who should I reach out to, you're one of the folks that I focus on. What is it that the full spectrum of services that you guys provide? Can you just touch on that and why maybe a buyer should do it once they're under LOI, or maybe even a seller consider doing it on their site before they sell it?
Sure. Yeah, I'll start with just explaining the kind of 3 buckets, I guess you'd say, of types of people who work with us. The first is somebody who wants an assessment of whether or not they should move forward on a deal. So that's where we look at the risk and what's the common valuation for a business in that range and of that type. So one of the things we do at Centurica is we aggregate a lot of the major brokers in our industry. So like last year, 2016, we aggregated, I think, about 500 listings, and we're able to take that data, analyze it to kind of look at averages and things like that. And it just kind of gives people a starting point. It's not by any means a true valuation, but we're able to take that and look at, what are the positive factors that might increase that valuation? What are the negative factors that might decrease it? Things like that. So we get a little bit into that in our pre-offer before you've signed a letter of intent or before you've agreed upon a price. That's risk assessment and analysis. After you've signed an LOI, and I should say that what I always guide people before signing an LOI or before agreeing on a price or even before making an offer is basically to ask the questions that you need to ask of the seller and the broker and take them for their word, right? So once you've signed the LOI and you've agreed upon a price and terms and things like that, then your job is to verify that all of those claims were actually accurate. And in some cases, it can be a seller who's trying to be misleading, but 9 times out of 10, it's often that it's just a simple mistake that gets overlooked. For instance, they're off by 4 or 5% or something like that on their profit and loss statement because of XYZ reasons, bookkeeping reasons, or some personal expenses involved or something like that.
Let's talk real example. I mean, you were just hired by the buyer of one of my businesses. And the financials were a little confusing. We did the absolute best we could, and we had to put the listing out, then pull it back, then pull it back out again, or put it back out again. And in doing so, I think there were probably about $3,000 of travel and meals and entertainment that was in as an add back, meaning it was personal and wouldn't carry forward. Upon review, your team found it for the buyer. I verified it with my seller, and my seller said, yeah, no, that's real legitimate costs. I don't know why that is in the add back. Right. And so that's the kind of thing that you find. And the thing that I always advise buyers and sellers, when that happens, and occasionally it does happen, you just use math and logic to make an adjustment. So if it's a 3-time multiple and there's $1,000 adjustment, it's $3,000 off the agreed upon purchase price.
Yeah, certainly that's very fair. And the only time where that may not be a proper approach is if there's something fundamental that you were under the assumption of before you verified it. An example of that might be that you asked, this doesn't happen often with quiet light brokerages, but there's a lot of brokerages that are out there. So, but for instance, if you asked a seller, "Hey, I'm considering buying your Amazon FBA business. Have you ever been suspended or had any policy warnings from Amazon?" And they tell you no. And then you go back and you have Centurica or yourself hop on a screen share with that seller, show you their Amazon account, and it's very clear that they actually do have suspensions and things like that. And that might fundamentally change what you're willing to pay or whether or not you'd want to move forward on that deal. So it's very important in my mind that I want to trust but verify, right? I want to trust what they're telling me, and I'm going to base my offer and all those kinds of things. But if what they told me is not actually what's there, then I need to make a decision whether that's a renegotiation of price terms or maybe it means walking away from the deal.
Yeah, I agree 100%. When we go into letter of intent, it's a big deal. It's a big deal for the seller and the buyer, and it can get very emotional along the way to closing. I tell people the easy part of what I do is creating a great marketing package, doing a great client interview, putting the financials together, getting the listing out there. We've got a great buyer database. They find it, they love it, they go under a letter of intent. The hard part is managing it from letter of intent to closing because of due diligence and the emotions that can happen. Can you share with us, maybe if you can without revealing names, what is the most egregious error or worst situation you've seen when a buyer comes to you after they're under letter of intent and ask you to do a due diligence report? You comfortable sharing that?
I mean, I certainly couldn't give specifics, but I would tell you that our industry has come a long way over the years. And it tends to be that the people who hire Centurica, in many cases, are hiring us after working with a reputable brokerage firm, right? And the simplest way I could put it is that the egregious stuff happens less and less, I've found over the years since I've started in this industry. So I think that's a really good trend that I'm seeing. However, in terms of egregious sort of stuff, I think the ones, I'll give you one example that I see, I don't want to say often, but I do see it more often than you might hope, is and often this is how a business is presented by a brokerage. It's, for example, they use annual profit and loss numbers in order to hide a negative trend that's happening in the business. So an example is they will give you the previous full year financials, but they won't give you the month by month breakdown. And when you start digging into it, you realize that the thing has dropped off substantially. Let's say it's March of 2017. You look at the 2016 numbers, they all look great. But when you look at January through March, there's a 50 or 60% drop in the business. And it's not upfront. It's not explained at all. So that's one that I do occasionally see that I'm just like, I don't know why people do that other than to try to catch the unsophisticated buyer. And that's where somebody like Centurica comes in and can help at least make those people aware of what they're buying. To me, it's not my job to tell them whether or not they should buy it. My job is that they know what they're getting into, right?
What an epic waste of time for the buyer, the seller, the broker to put together an annual profit and loss report and hide that, because it's going to come out in due diligence. Mm-hmm. And thankfully people hire you for that. What if you can, what are the most obvious things that a buyer should look for as they're looking at a business in your opinion, and what they should look for as far as due diligence prior to the LOI?
Yeah, I would say number one is start with the profit and loss statement. It's always where I start because it will tell a story, and sometimes that story is not completely clear, but oftentimes it will tell a story. I mean, and specifically it needs to be a breakdown by month, at least the trailing 12 months. So I would say that's a like in terms of fundamental things you want to look at, that's super key. And just understanding what are the trends of the business. Is there seasonality involved? Is there, what are the capital requirements if it's e-commerce? What are the cost of goods sold? Is there enough margins to work with on the business? Things like that. So I'd say at a fundamental level, that's a good place to start. Now, if most businesses these days will have some kind of analytics, traffic analytics that are installed. The most common one we see is Google Analytics. And that would be the second place to start, because when you think about it, a business's revenue is driven directly by an online business specifically, in many cases is driven by their ability to drive traffic. Now, there are always exceptions to that. There are a lot of word of mouth businesses. There are a lot of businesses that are sold as online businesses that actually have a pretty big offline component. But if it's an online business that's driven by some form of traffic, whether it's Google organic, whether it's paid search, social media, etc., when you look at the Google Analytics, you'll be able to get a sense of what's actually happening with that traffic, what are the sources of the traffic, and then you can dive deeper into the drivers of that traffic. So for instance, if you see that 50% of the traffic is coming from Google Organic, that tells you, well, I should probably go read the content on the website to see what kind of quality they have. I should probably look at what's going on with the backlinks to make sure that those are all high quality, that there's good ones, if there's bad ones, that the good ones are outweighing the bad ones. So it really starts with understanding the source of the revenue tends to come from the traffic. And then you have to understand, how is that traffic being generated, and it is in a sustainable way.
What free tools are available to buyers that don't have your experience to find those backlinks? What's the best one that you'd look at?
For backlinks, the simplest one I would say is it's called Ahrefs, ahref.com or s.com. And essentially what they do is they send a crawler around the web to follow links. And then they store that into a database. So they can see kind of who links to who. So if you're considering buying xyz.com, you can punch xyz.com into the system, and it'll spit out a big list of backlinks of other people that are linking to them. And what you're looking for are high quality backlinks. So that might be from a Forbes.com, an entrepreneur.com, or an industry specific authority that's linking to that website. So let's say that I'm in the pet industry and I see that PetSmart, for instance, is linking to my website. That's a really good sign that you're trusted in that industry. So on the positive side, you're looking for those really good quality links. On the negative side, you're looking for instance, links that are, there's a lot of details I can go into if you want, but I'll just say at a simple level, you're looking for links that seem to have been artificially generated or that might be considered spam. And spam could be, a site that has a bunch of Chinese characters and, it doesn't appear to be a high quality site. So that's the simplest way I can put, that. I think Ahrefs is one of the best tools these days. There are others out there, but that's a great one to start with.
Okay, so big thing, look for monthly P&Ls, starting with the financials because it all starts there. Look at the trends, the age, so on and so forth. And then Google Analytics. What if they don't have Google Analytics installed properly or installed at all and use another analytics tool? Because as I hear sometimes, people are paranoid. They don't want Google knowing everything. What are the backups to that, or what are the alternatives if they don't have it installed properly, which I often see?
Yeah. You mentioned that some people are Google paranoid. That to me is a reason to put my alarm up, because if they're really worried about what Google is going to do to them, that oftentimes tells you that it might be borderline on that money-making hack that I talked about. So that said,
good to know.
there are some good tools like SEMRush, for instance, that and actually Ahrefs as well. It will give you a sense of how much traffic a given site is generating from Google search specifically. What SEMRush and even Ahrefs do is that they go out and they have a big database of all these keywords of things that people might search for. And then they go out and they index who is ranking for those terms. And they've been indexing that over the years. So you can actually punch in a tool like that and get a good sense of how much organic traffic and what are the trends over time for that organic traffic. In addition to organic, it'll also tell you if they're using AdWords, which is the paid version of Google's services. So those are a couple of good tools. There's several out there depending on how a site generates traffic, but in terms of organic specifically, that's a good, that's our backup. If, for instance, a broker or seller doesn't want to give us analytics access, is we'll use some tools like that to give us a sense of what's going on.
Wouldn't that be a big red flag if the broker doesn't want to give you analytics access?
It depends on where you are in the deal. If it's pre-offer, pre-LOI, in many cases, some sellers are hesitant to do that. Where that tells me is that there may not be a big moat for that business. And when I say moat, it means a defensible sort of business model that's there.
Right.
So, again, it's so hard to say when something is a red flag or not, because it really depends upon the buyer and the buyer's experience and what they're comfortable with and what they're not. So for our standard reports, the two that I've mentioned so far, we try to be as objective as possible. And we don't really take a lot of context into account for that particular buyer. But we do have a service where we basically handhold buyers from start to finish. And we do a lot more just subjective analysis with those buyers based on their experience, history, strengths, and weaknesses.
So do you act as a buyer's broker in a sense from beginning to end, helping them with the negotiation on the deal, or just an analysis of it, saying these are the details, you make the offer you want?
Yeah, we act as an advisor. We don't act as a broker. And why I want to make that distinction is that we don't want to be incentivized for a deal to complete. So from my understanding, a typical buyer's broker, it gets a commission if a deal completes. We want to remain as neutral as possible in our guidance and advice. And so we just charge a flat fee. And then basically they have a period of time where they can look at as many deals as they want. If one falls apart, we'll go to the next one with them. So our intention is really going in that, if you found a deal that you're interested in, we're going to do all we can to help you make a decision, number one, if you want to move forward with it. And then two, once you've decided you want to move forward with it, we want to make that process as smooth and quick as possible, because that makes it better for everybody, essentially. So, that means doing quick due diligence. That means giving them reassurance at different periods of time. And it also means letting them know, hey, you don't have a lot of experience with SEO. It looks like this business is really driven by SEO. I would say that I want you to go into this deal, number one, either with your eyes open and you need to get educated really quickly, or number two, let me connect you with somebody who's really good at SEO to fill that gap, right?
That's excellent advice to point out their weaknesses and their strengths, because some people think they can do everything, and the buyer may, or the seller may have a certain level of expertise that is really hard to transfer because they've developed it over a number of years.
Right.
We're running a little short on time, but I wanted to ask you about what we see as a very prevalent e-commerce business transaction these days, which is FBA businesses, Amazon-based businesses that have grown. We generally won't list or sell them unless they're at least 24 months old. We've sold them a little younger. But when people are buying those, what can you do in terms of looking at that third-party platform and helping buyers out in the due diligence process?
Yeah, at a macro level, the one thing I would tell you is that every quote-unquote business model in the online space requires its own separate approach to due diligence. Amazon FBA is oftentimes a little bit different in how you approach that compared to a software as a service business, for instance. So that's the first thing I want to make sure that people know, is that every business model that you're going after, and however they make money, you have to do specific due diligence around that. So when I talk about Amazon FBA specifically, the things that I like to look for are, number one, what is the diversity of SKUs of that business? And what that tells me is, are you relying upon one product? And if, for instance, a competitor comes in 6 months and starts to degrade your listing exposure, like how exposed are you in that case? So that's one thing that I think is really important, is to look at, is there one product, or are there multiple products that are contributing to the sales of that business? Two, it's really important to look at your seller metrics in Amazon. And, sometimes you can do this before actually making an offer. Sometimes you have to wait till later. So, it could just be as simple as asking the seller some simple questions around that. But once you have access and you can see it, what you can do is you can go in there and you can see how that seller is selling. So are they selling through a FBA directly, or are they doing third-party fulfillment? If let's just assume that in this case we're talking about FBA directly, you want to really take a look at things like the A to Z guarantee rate, which is essentially your refund rate. Oftentimes that will tell you your product quality. So if you buy a business that has a crappy product, you're maybe are more at risk than one that has great product quality. Two, I think an important thing to look at is the product reviews, both the positive and the negative, and look at those product reviews in relation to other competitive products in the space. So for instance, is there an 800-pound gorilla that has thousands of reviews and you've only got 2 in this business that you're buying? So those are a few basic things. Seller metrics is really important because at the end of the day with FBA, you're playing in Amazon's sandbox. So you need to play by their rules. And that is something that not everybody has done successfully over time. And in some cases, it's not even their fault that they haven't done it successfully over time, unfortunately, with how Amazon works. So seller metrics, reviews, and then the last thing I would say is to look at their notifications. Take a very deep dive into any notifications. You sometimes will see that they're selling products that are against Amazon's policies. Sometimes you'll see that they get high complaints from customers and they get warnings around that. There's a lot of different warnings that Amazon could potentially have, but those are all stored in that Amazon FBA account, so you can see what's happened with it over time.
Chris, this is the first time that you and I have had a lengthy conversation. Been out to Rhodium a couple of times, and you're running the show, so you're always very, very busy.
Right.
You have the same philosophy and character and guidelines, I think, that everybody here at Quiet Light does. Everything you've talked about, we look for those same exact things when we take on a new client. I will not even get on a valuation phone call with someone if they can't provide me monthly P&Ls. We just stop it right there in the tracks. So all these things you're saying are fantastic. Do you find that you're sort of at odds with business brokers at times, or brokerage firms, because you're there to help that buyer make a great investment? And I am too, because that buyer will eventually become a seller and they will refer other people to us. But I don't think everyone looks at it that way. Do you find you're at odds with some firms? Are they hesitant to work with you in due diligence when the buyer insists on it?
Actually, yes. There are a couple of firms out there that unfortunately, if a buyer tells them, I'm planning to use Centurica, they won't even work with the buyer. And I'm working hard to remedy that relationship. And at the end of the day, I don't know if it's correlation versus causation. In other words, that buyer probably wouldn't have moved forward on the deal anyway. And they wanted Centurica to actually tell them what they're suspecting is actually, somebody else sees the same thing, right? So I think there's a propensity perhaps that some of the people who are utilizing our reports with certain brokerages tend to be a more skeptical buyer in the beginning. And also they tend to be a less experienced buyer. Those who are, for instance, they've done 20 deals over the last 5 years or something like that. Oftentimes those types of people may or may not want to use a company like Centurica because they have their own processes that they've developed and subjective sort of analysis that they do. So we tend also to work with the newer buyers as well. So, so unfortunately, yeah, I think to your point, it is a challenge. And we do all we can. One of the things we've instituted recently is a policy of allowing the broker and the seller to tell their side of the story, to put it simply, or in other words, to give context when we point out a risk. So what we don't want to be is just somebody who's poking holes in a deal to try to scare off a buyer. What we want to be is somebody who lets a buyer know of potential risks and then help facilitate the context that needs to be provided by a seller and a broker. So that's one way that we've helped to address that. And at the end of the day, I think if a broker is scared of Centurica being involved, then I think that they probably have listed a business that perhaps maybe is not great for the type of buyer that we usually work for, and perhaps they may be better off working with a buyer who is more experienced and knows what they're getting themselves into. So that's the simplest way I think about it.
No, I think that's great. Buyer beware if the broker doesn't want to work with you. For what it's worth, and for anybody listening or watching, brokers, buyers, sellers alike, I think, over the last 5 years, maybe only a dozen or so of buyers of my clients' businesses have used Centurica, and each and every one of them has made it through to closing. There's not one that your report derailed the listing in terms of not being able to close. Your reports have absolutely pointed out flaws and errors and things that can be improved upon, and I think that was a valuable resource to the buyer. And I think on a couple of occasions like the ones we just mentioned, you found a flaw in the P&L, a mistake, an error, an oversight, and it was corrected with math and logic, and the transaction continued to close. So I appreciate what you do, Chris. I think you're out there really, really helping buyers and sellers alike. Sellers should listen to what you say and prepare in advance of a sale. Exit planning, I think, is key. They should do that well in advance, 6, 12, 18 months in advance of a sale, so that they're prepared for the transaction. It can be in the best position to sell for the maximum value to the right buyer, so that buyer can take over the business and continue the growth that they've been doing for a number of years. So how do folks find out about Centurica? Where do they go? How do they reach out to you? What should they look at in order to learn about your services, Chris?
Yeah, so I would say, well, number one is obviously our website, centurica.com, and it's CENTURICA.com. One of the places I might recommend starting is our website buyers report. I mentioned that we aggregate a bunch of listings and we compile that into one thing. It's a free download directly available from our website. And then the other thing that you can do from our website is actually schedule a 15-minute call directly with me. I really enjoy this stuff. I mean, I've been doing it for years. I want to help guide people in the right direction and not make some of the same mistakes that I've made. And I think Warren Buffett said something along the lines is that the trick is to learn from other people's mistakes instead of making them yourself. And so my job is to help people not make the same types of mistakes that I've seen others make and made myself. So yeah, you can hop on there and schedule a 15-minute call free as well. And I think that'd be two really good places to start to get you some foundational knowledge of the company and how we can help people.
That's fantastic. Chris, this has been great. I appreciate getting to know you a little bit more, chatting with you, and having you on the podcast and helping out people that are listening. Thanks for all you do, man. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on. Thanks a lot, Joe.